Okay, so this diagram, which also came out of your readings, describes how legal entities, the group 2 entities, can relate to group 1 entities in various ways. So starting with the most abstract, we see that a work can be created by a person or corporate body. An expression is realized by a person or corporate body. A manifestation is produced by a person or corporate body. And an item is owned by a person or corporate body. Now, these are all pretty straightforward relationships. So, probably the one that's most difficult to grapple with is the difference between the is created by and is realized by. But it's just because they want to distinguish the the bigger sort of intellectual step that's taken by the person who creates a work in its original form, and then an expression is realized by a person or corporate body. So that would be the expression would be sort of translated by or interpreted by. So whatever the expression is, whatever its relationship with the work is, someone did that. It could even be the same person who created, or the same corporate body for that matter, who created the original work. But it's just important to understand that a work and an expression are two different things, and that while they can be created by the same entity or the same person or corporate body, they aren't necessarily created by the same entity or corporate body. Manifestation is produced by a person or corporate body. Most traditionally, that would be your publisher. A publisher is the corporate body that creates a manifestation, and then an item is owned by a person or a corporate body. For instance, if a bookstore buys a case of novels from a certain publisher, then the bookstore owns those novels until they're sold to individual customers, and then each item can go to a different customer. And finally, that brings us to the diagram of how group 3 entities relate with group 1 or group 2 entities. And group 3 entities can be any of the entity types from group 1 or group 2. In addition, group 3 entities can be concepts, objects, events, or places. And so this describes the subject relationship. This is getting to our aboutness or essence, as it was described in the Ferber constructs under relationships. You'll also see that the subject relationship only pertains to a work, that a work is the thing that has a subject. An expression is expected to have the same subjects as the work that the expression derives. And so a work can have as a subject any item from that list of things in orange, blue, and yellow. A work can has as its subject a work, an expression, a manifestation, or an item, a person or a corporate body, a concept, object, event, or place. So any of those entity types is legal fodder for to be the subject of a work. So the Ferber conceptual system, even though it's relatively, succinct and compact, really allows for the description of almost any kinds of relationships that need to be expressed during the process of bibliographic control. Again, that's sort of what we're getting back to here. We opened the session by discussing at length what bibliographic control entails, and it really has to do with the description of resources, which should be systematic. And a lot of the description of resources has to do with defining relationships among resources, between resources and other resources, and also between resources and subjects for subject cataloging, and also between resources and people for attribution and publication and even use. So we started with the general idea of bibliographic control. And then we talked about Ferber as a conceptual system that sort of maps out in this tidy way of entities and relationships that we've grown so fond of this semester. And now RDA is a specific resource, it's a procedure that's used in libraries all over the world, but not all libraries. It's relatively new, so there have been some adoption hiccups, we shall say. Um, but RDA is really proving to be the new standard for doing descriptive cataloging, doing the activities of bibliographic control. Um, you were all given access and passwords and the reading guidelines for, and maybe also by email. Can't quite remember, over how to access the RDA toolkit, which allows you to read the introduction. So what we'll do for the remainder of the lecture is just to sort of breeze through an understanding of what RDA is, what it does, and how it pertains to Ferber. Because RDA basically took the previous widespread descriptive cataloging system, which was called AACR2R, which stands for Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, 2nd edition, revised. RDA is also known as AACR3. It's supposed to be the next edition of the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules. But for one thing, they wanted to improve the richness of bibliographic relationships, and they saw the semantic web, and Ferber is good, sort of foundational systems to do that. And also, the fact that these were Anglo-American cataloging rules was really resonant in how they were coming across. So when they decided to update AACR2 into something new, they tried to be really conscientious of the fact that we do live in a global and much more inclusive world than we did when the previous editions of AACR2 came out. So that's sort of how RDA was born from the semantic web and Ferber. According to the RDA introduction, RDA provides a set of guidelines and instructions for formulating data to support resource discovery. And that's really just another way of saying that RDA provides a set of guidelines for doing bibliographic control. RDA was created as being implemented by RDA's Joint Steering Committee, and you can see that there are different types of organizations and organizations from around the world, although not completely inclusive culturally. But this is not just something that was unilaterally released by, the Library of Congress or some other driving organization. They've been really, again, conscientious to include members on their committee and to include a lot of dialogue, which has made it also somewhat agonizing and slow because they really do consider things in depth before turning them into policy. So let's move on and discuss RDA a little bit further. The purpose of RDA, the data created using RDA to describe a resource are designed to assist users performing the following tasks: find, identify, select, and obtain. So sort of similar to the people who created the Ferber conceptual system, the RDA guidelines were, they started with the user instead of starting with the resource. So this is a user-oriented system rather than a system-oriented system. Because they're not focused on solely on the characteristics of the resources. They're focused on what are the things that users need to do when they're seeking information. They need to find, identify, select, and obtain. And then from there, RDA sought to find a way to describe information resources in a way that will help users perform those tasks. So they sort of took that page out of Ferber's book. Not literally, they probably came up with this idea to be user-oriented, all by themselves, but there's definitely a parallel there. So this slide about RDA's scope really gets back to linking RDA with Ferber. So in the RDA introduction, they say that the data created using RDA to describe an entity associated with a resource, excuse me, and a resource can be a person, family, corporate body, concept, etc., are designed to assist users performing the following tasks: finding, identifying, clarifying, and understanding. But it's in these descriptions that we start seeing the parallels back to Ferber. So the data created using RDA to describe an entity associated with a resource are designed to assist users who are finding. Users want to find information on that entity and on resources associated with the entity. So there's some Ferber right there. Again, in traditional cataloging practices, the capacity just wasn't there to create strong associations between information resources. For instance, you might be able to say that one book comes from a series and that another book comes from that same series, but you don't necessarily have a way of linking those two books directly to each other. They're only linked indirectly through the series. Another way that you can see this exemplified is the fact that when you're in your typical library catalog, there's not a lot of hyperlinking going on. There might be a hyperlink from subject headings where you can click on a subject heading in a catalog record and then see a list of all the books in the entire library that are cataloged with that subject heading. You can usually do the same thing with an author's name, but you can't usually see in a record. You can't click on a series title if it says that a book is from a series and see all the books that are in that series. So that's what it's talking about with finding resources that are associated with the entity. Using the Ferber relationships, you can start describing bibliographic relationships systematically. And you know how much we love systematicity when we're doing bibliographic control. So RDA descriptions can also help users identify to confirm that the entity described corresponds to the entity sought, or to distinguish between two or more entities with similar names, etc. So identify, this example really gets to the nitty-gritty of allowing people to distinguish between two different expressions of the same work. If they are two different editions or two different translations, then what is the difference of them and what is their relationship to the original work? So if you go into a traditional library catalog and you do a search for Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, you'll get a whole bunch of output. You'll get tons of output because there are different expressions of Romeo and Juliet. There are different translations, different productions stored on different media. Excuse me. And there are also scads and scads of resources that have been written about Romeo and Juliet, or different expressions of Romeo and Juliet, or Romeo and Juliet as work. So this identify thing really starts teasing apart, and clarifying does the same thing. Okay, very briefly, just, navigating through RDA. RDA as a guide, or as a document, is divided into 10 sections of instructions, guidelines, both of which are rich with examples. They've done a great job with examples. So sections 1 through 4 of those 10 are for describing attributes, and then sections 5 through 10 are for describing relationships. And so it's through expressing attributes and relationships that one can describe a resource.